one of the reasons why Hobbes is so interesting and important, you see this clash was happening between science and religion. What was going on at the time? Science was becoming more and more prominent. And science was giving explanations for all these questions which people were attributing before to God. They thought God is responsible for all this, and now science was giving more specific answers to all these questions. How do you deal with it? One of the biggest questions, of course, again, freedom of the will. Because you see, if you trust in science, if you think, and Hobbes wasn't even an atheist, he believed in God. But according to some thinkers of the time, it still made sense to think that, yeah, God has set up the universe, but then the universe is like this clock mechanism, clockwork, right? Like the clock, you wind it up and it keeps on going. Same thing here. All these laws are strict laws which govern everything, and the science seems like it was confirming it more and more. But then what about human beings? Can human beings have freedom of the will under these conditions? Because it seems like everything is determined by these rules. And Hobbes is saying, no, we are like robots. But what is the implication of that then? Now, one big problem then becomes, can you like even then hold somebody responsible for murder or for theft? Because they can just tell you, you know, well, this is the laws of physics. My brain is controlled by all this stuff. It's not my fault. What can I do? You know, I had to murder them. But it seems wrong, right? It seems that we kind of feel like we actually can decide whether to murder somebody or not. And it's not determined. It's not like the flipping a coin. It actually is in our power not to murder other people. So that is a big question. Some philosophers, such as Descartes, thought they could be good neighbors, the religion and science, if they stayed on their side of the fence. So religion deals with religious questions, science deals with scientific questions, and it's fine for them to do their own thing. They don't interfere. Descartes was big on science, but he also was deeply religious. Others thought two approaches to the world could be neatly integrated in an all-encompassing metaphysical system. So you can explain God within this whole thing. You don't need to separate them. You can combine it. And then there were other thinkers who saw science as religion as natural enemies. So then you have to pick one of the sides. Either you sign for science and then you can't believe in God, or you are religious and then forget the science. That's just dangerous stuff. So this is the three more or less typical approaches at the time. Now early modern philosophers, including Hobbes and including Descartes, were trying to, first of all, start from scratch. They did not want any longer to follow tradition and authority. They wanted to build their own system. Why? Because they thought that all this stuff they learned themselves in university was no longer working. Remember, universities at the time still used this scholastic system. They used Aristotle to put together Bible and Aristotle and explain all these things. But we already are several hundred years past this time, the Aquinas' time. So people were already questioning that. The big question here is the problem of authority. Medieval philosophy based on authority. The Bible, the Aristotle, they are the authority. They are not questioned. The question is how to combine them. Modern philosophy rejects the authority. It tries to build everything by themselves from scratch. What do you think could be problematic about following the authority? Is there any problem with that? Yeah.
I forget the philosopher, but one of them mentioned that even the people in charge can also do wrong and be wrong. So that's the problem. One of the problems with following authority.
Well, exactly, right? If you are building something on authority, we all humans can you be sure that these people, as smart as they were, even like Aristotle or whoever, never made a mistake? Have you never discovered that somebody is a big authority but they make mistakes? Of course. We see it all the time. It seems like people are more have tendency to accept authority if it was somebody who died long time ago. The longer, the better. But in reality, do you think people 2,000, 3,000 years ago were somehow smarter than we are? Probably not. I would think, if anything, they probably were a little more stupid, because at least now we have more education and so on, better science. So that's the problem. And the philosophers actually were trying to search for a new method, find a new method of doing things. How do you actually study the world? How do you approach the world? Which is why epistemology, remember, theory of knowledge, was very strong. Epistemology a question such as how do we know things? Can we know things? And also philosophy of mind, how our mind works. What is the relation of our mind to the world? And this is where we start the most interesting and exciting philosophical questions. So first of all, there is a kind of a split at the time, and we classify these philosophers as rationalists or empiricists. It's important to understand they themselves did not classify themselves this way. This is actually later when we decided that that could be a good system to follow. That's one important point. The other important point is there's no clear dividing line. It's not like you can say, okay, this philosopher is definitely rationalist and this philosopher is definitely empiricist. You kind of can, but in the same time, there are elements of empiricism and some rationalists, elements of rationalism and some empiricists. Nonetheless, especially for purposes of simplification, we can do it, and most philosophers today kind of agree more or less about most of them, whether you classify them as rationalists or empiricists. So what is the difference between rationalists and empiricists? Rationalists believe that reason is a primary source of knowledge. You can literally do all the knowledge in your head. Right? You can get to things using logic. A priori knowledge would be kind of reason that prior to experience, right? Which is why it's called in Latin a priori. Prior to you don't even need to experience anything. You can know things yourself. Descartes is like that. As hopefully if you did the reading, you understand why. If not, we will talk about it. But Descartes is rationalist. But there are also empiricists. Empiricists thought, no, actually, you only know things after you experience them. So first, you have to have some sort of experience of something, and then you apply your reason, of course, but you learn these things kind of post factum, a posteriori, posterior to the experience. So this is a priori, a posteriori. A priori prior to experience, a posteriori posterior or after the experience. Okay, so this is the table from the book. It kind of gives us more or less good idea about the differences. First of all, rationalists mainly were on the continent in Europe, continental, in opposition to empiricists, which are mainly British. The Britain is an island, right? You know, it's like a big island. So that's why this one's called continental. This one's just British. Continental rationalists. There's three of them. We will talk about two of them. Book has all three, but we don't have time for all of them. Descartes and Spinoza, who we will talk about on Thursday. They are both rationalists. So what is more, I'd say, specific for them? They all centered around France, Holland, Germany, this area. For them, genuine knowledge has its foundation in thought or reason. So, in your head. That's where the foundation is. The mind is full of rational content. You can find inborn ideas. That's important for them too. Inborn ideas, meaning it's already there when you're born. Where does it come from? Well, probably from God, right? God already puts it in there. Innate principles, same thing. It's already there. So it's kind of like this software which is already there when you're born. and rational structure. Foundational knowledge is self-evident, certain, known independently of experience. So before you go to experience, of course experience also plays a role in your knowledge. You cannot just, after you're born, sit in a dark room and know things. But before that happens, the foundational part is this kind of rational structure which is already there, this inborn ideas and everything else. It's already there. Foundational truths are universal because they are part of the content of every mind and necessary features of the world. So there's certain rules, such as law of non-contradiction and so on, that is already in the mind of every living creature, not just human beings, but even any other creature, and part of the world itself. So that's how the world is made up. Now, what's the difference with empiricists? Empiricists are mainly from Great Britain. So Bacon, we didn't talk about him. Hobbes, who we talked about last time. Locke, who we'll talk about next week. Berkeley and Hume, who we'll talk about after the spring break. Centered in England, Ireland, Scotland, the British Isles, right? Genuine knowledge has its foundation in experience, not in reason. The mind is a blank tablet, tabula rasa, they used in Latin. Tabula rasa. When you're born, there is literally nothing there. It's like an empty page. Nothing is there. Everything you learn from experience. The first experience being, of course, your parents, whatever you see, whatever you feel, and so on and so forth. And it starts kind of writing up these rules, including the law of non-contradiction. How do you know this law? Well, you experience stuff, you understand what it means, and that kind of writes the rules into your brain, which you later use for other things. All knowledge about the world is probable, contingent, based on experience. So you cannot be completely sure about anything, because things actually has to be experienced in order to understand how they work. You cannot reason your way to them. And some ideas seem to be universal, only seem to be universal. They're not really universal. So even though we all agree on them, but why? Because we all have the same experiences, right? If we didn't have the same experience as other people, maybe we would have different ideas. But since we do, that's why it seems like we all agree on the law of non-contradiction. Because we are all humans, we all have the same experience. So that's the explanation for British empiricists. Now let's talk a little bit about René Descartes. René Descartes was born in France in a little town called La Haye, March 31st, 1596, the very end of the 16th century. Even though he was born in this little town, he left it almost, his parents left it almost, and he himself obviously couldn't leave it, but his parents left it almost right away. He never lived there, but they are so proud of him that today they renamed their town Descartes. So they have a museum or something there. Why? Because it's a small town. They don't have much to be proud of. But there you go. The famous philosopher was born there. Then he got scholastic education. So remember scholasticism, that's how they taught him. And he went to a very religious Jesuit college of La Flèche. It was a good college, but it was very religious college. Jesuits. Do you guys know who Jesuits are? Nobody? So first of all, yeah. So just a little bit easier way to think about it, they were very, very devout Catholics. It's like the most Catholics of all the Catholics. There are Catholics and there's Jesuits. And the Jesuits are like super Catholics. So that's basically how you can think about that. Really, really pro-Pope, pro-traditional Catholic Church, against all this heresy, all this other Protestantism, all this other stuff. So that was his education. Early on, you got these 3 dreams when he was a soldier. The book goes into more detail. We're not going to list his entire life. He drafted as a soldier to experience the world because he thought that this experience will teach him something. It only taught him never to become a soldier, really. That was not fun. And during his service, he had these 3 vivid dreams. November 10th, 1619, which told him he has a mission in life. He has to actually find the key to the mysteries of nature in a new philosophy based on mathematics. Philosophy based on mathematics wasn't new. Galileo already, who actually lived before Descartes, Galileo already has worked with this. Well, actually not before. They have overlapping. But anyway, Galileo was working on it a little bit before Descartes, but nonetheless Descartes also accepted this mathematical approach to nature. Now, he wrote quite a lot of books, but many of them he did not publish. One of the books he did not publish precisely because of Galileo. It's his ideas about the world, right? He wrote a book, and then Galileo was prosecuted and like almost lost his life, right? So Descartes heard about it and decided not to publish it, not to take any chances, because it also seemed like the kind of book the church would not enjoy. But he published a couple of books. Most of his works, though, were published after he died. How did he die? That's kind of a sad story. So the Queen of Sweden, Christina, was a huge fan of his, and she invited him to be her tutor. Why did he go? Nobody knows. He actually didn't need money that much. He had enough money to live, but for some reason he decided that it's a good idea to move to Sweden and become her teacher. I don't know if you guys are familiar with European weather, but Netherlands is much milder climate than Sweden. He moved to Sweden in the middle of the winter. It was very cold. There was snow everywhere. And to make it worse, for whatever reason, Queen decided that she wants to get lessons at 5 a.m. I guess she was a very early riser. Now, Descartes himself was not an early riser. He liked to sleep late, and he was already in his 50s. So the whole thing with the cold weather, getting that at 5 a.m. and all this stuff has weighed so much on him that he got sick and died. So that was a very unfortunate result. Back then they didn't have much medicine, as you can imagine, so if you got seriously ill, that's not much anybody could do. The most typical treatment was bleeding. For whatever reason, they thought if they cut your veins and the blood comes out, somehow bad things will come out too. And obviously that had an opposite effect because people got weaker. They were already weak because of the disease. And so anyway, sad end to this story. He died on February 11th, 1650. He's like 4 years old or something. So goal number one, to find certainty. He wants to find certainty. He wants to be sure at least about something. Doubts about what to believe and conflicting opinions everywhere. But has to be at least something you can start with. And then he wants to develop universal science based on that stuff. Like start from a certain point and build on top of it. So he could have the universal science. Something which actually explains everything. And then another goal he has, important goal, which was partly inspired by people like Hobbes, is to reconcile this mechanistic view of the world and human freedom. Because you see it's becoming more and more of a problem. People like Hobbes start saying we don't have any freedom, we are like robots. And Descartes is actually trying to find a way around it. He's trying to explain everything so that science would not suffer, but also in the same time religion would not suffer. Can you still believe in God and believe in human freedom and believe in this entire picture of the universe following these laws? So he's looking for a method. He's looking for a method. He wants to use mathematics. He thinks mathematics definitely is like this universal structure of everything. First of all, he wants to use intuition to find those self-evident truths. He thinks we can find them using our intuition because they are kind of within us. And then deductive method, necessary inference, because for those of you who took 102, hopefully you remember deductive method, right? You have principles of some sort, general principles, and then you can apply them to particular cases. Like law of gravity, for example, right? That's the law. if you know the law of gravity, any object, let's take this bottle, if I drop it, is it gonna fall? Yes. If I do the same thing to, let's say, my glasses, are they gonna fall? Yes. Because that general law of gravity applies to every single case. So he wants to find these kinds of laws, and that's why he is kind of talking about it. That is the beginning. In the reading he says, some years ago, I was struck by a large number of falsehoods that I accepted as true in my childhood. I realized that it was necessary once in the course of my life to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundations. It may seem a little bit extreme, but he says, compares it to a basket of apples, right? If you have a basket of apples, some of them good, some of them bad, what's the best way to figure out which ones are good, which ones are bad? Can you dig one by one and like, okay, this one's good? And no, you're going to get confused. He's saying the best way is to empty the entire bucket, take them all out, and then inspect them one by one, and if it's good, put them back. So that's why he's trying to demolish everything and find one thing. It's like fulcrum, right? Archimedean point. Archimedes said that if you give me a fulcrum, I can grab on, I can turn the earth. But I need this fulcrum. Same thing here. He needs to find something to grab onto, a certain thing which is definitely true and beyond any doubt. Okay, so let's see what happens there. It's the method of doubt, but the doubt is not the goal. The goal is to find certainty. So he's doing the whole thing to find certainty and to actually discover many things, hopefully, which he cannot doubt. But to start with, just at least one. So first of all, what can be doubted? In the reading, you see, and if you read the whole thing, there's even more. He starts with sense experience. Can you trust your senses? He says not really, because for the most part, they seem to be telling you the truth, but not always. For one thing, obviously, even if you look at something, let's say the stick in the water, it may appear bent, when in fact it's not, because of the way light breaks in the water. But not only that, have you never discovered that you were sleeping and you thought you were doing something and then you wake up and turns out you were not doing that? Right? And remember, you can even think about what we think reality, this famous example from like the Matrix movie. Can we even be sure we're in this room? Have you watched the Matrix? Anybody watch the Matrix? So what was happening in the Matrix? It's a great movie. It's kind of old now, I guess. But nonetheless, I would recommend it. A great philosophical movie. So it turned out the entire world was fake. They were really controlled by the agents. Everybody was like in this capsule with some sort of liquid, and there were wires attached to their heads. But they thought they live in the real world, because the wires were sending signals into their brains, and they thought that was the reality. The main hero in the movie is given a choice. This guy tells him, there's a red pill and a blue pill, and if you take the red one, you will find out the truth. And if you take the blue one, you will fall asleep, wake up, and not remember any of this. And he took the red one. And as soon as he took the red one, he woke up. But he woke up in this capsule, right, with stuff attached to his head, and detached it, and then came out, and it turned out the whole world is like this horrible dump, right? And people live there. There's just a few of them who discovered the truth, and they are on this little submarine sailing around trying to avoid those agents who are hunting for them. They can go back sometimes if they attach stuff to their heads, and they have again like the enter the system, right? But they have to be careful because agents are after them. So I'm not going to give you the entire plot, but that's an idea. And the philosophical question here is, can we be sure that's not happening to us? Can you be completely sure you are sitting in this room right now, and you are not in some sort of a matrix when you really are have stuff attached to your head. It's even easier to imagine now than, hundreds of years ago at the time of Descartes, because we actually can do it now. They already have stuff like this, right? Have you heard like they have this thing for deaf people when they put something into your brain and you can hear stuff because the thing receives the impulses or something and it goes straight into your head? Similarly, they can simulate what you see because this is all just nerves, right? There are nerves there, they receive those impulses. So if you can simulate these impulses, your brain will think that you're seeing things and hearing things when in fact these things are not there. So the question is it completely impossible that all of us are right now being captured by some sort of agents and they are feeding us this fake information? The idea is the same for Descartes. He's like, can I be completely sure that my senses are not lying to me? And his answer is no. Even not just the dreams, but the reality itself could be fake. Even vivid sense experience, such as the belief we are right here in this room. More than that, he actually even doubts your mathematics. I don't know if you noticed that, but at one point he says, can we be sure that 2 plus 3 equal 5? What if it is like this consistent mistake? So he says, what if an evil demon is actually fooling us all and giving us all this fake stuff? We're completely sure about. And he says, yes, at the very least, that's the famous, it's in Latin because he wrote it in Latin first. Cogito, ergo sum. And sometimes for short it's just called cogito, Descartes' cogito. I think, therefore I am. You say somebody has to be at least experiencing all this stuff. Somebody has to be doing the thinking. And that's me. And that is something which cannot be false. It cannot be false. So that is one thing he found, and he said, okay, let me start building from that. But that's difficult, right? What do you, like, okay, we all agree that much is true. You can doubt other people, maybe there's no other people, they all phantoms, you can doubt mathematics, you can doubt everything. I am doing the thinking, definitely is true, but then what? Where do you get from there? Can you get out of this? This is the quote, he says, I am then a thing that thinks, that is, I am a mind. So he says to himself, I cannot doubt myself, so I am thinking thing. Cannot be doubted. Everything else actually, including my body, can be doubted. So he makes this distinction which will be important later. Because he says there are two types of things clearly. One of them is the minds, and the other one is all this physical stuff. So the minds cannot be doubted, my mind in particular, because I don't know if there are other minds, but I know there's mine. But everything else can be doubted. If he is stopping there, it's called solipsism. Solipsism is the idea that only my mind exists. Everything else is fake. Like literally. Which I guess you can argue too, right? You can say that I'm pretty sure I'm there, but I don't even know there's other people. I don't even know if you guys are sitting here right now. How can I be sure that you are not all images created by those agents or whoever? So that's called solipsism. But in order to live normal life and be a normal human being, you have to get out of it somehow. You have to somehow prove to yourself that other stuff exists, other people exist. So what is Descartes doing here? Well, for one thing, he says, okay, let me introduce this principle. If I perceive something clearly and distinctly, that must be true. And if it's not clearly and distinctly, then it's not true. So there are impulses and there's natural light. Natural light shows me things which are true, but impulses can lead me astray. I don't know if you can see it, but there's already a problem with that. There'll be criticism on this point, because how do I know if it's natural light or impulses? How do I know if I'm clearly and distinctly perceiving something or not so much? Doesn't it seem sometimes that you clearly and distinctly perceive something, but it actually is not true? But he thinks that certainly some things you can be sure about. So now we are entering metaphysics. It's no longer epistemology. It's not longer the question of how do we know things. It's the question, what is real? What is there? So Descartes moves from epistemological problem to the question of reality, and that includes the existence of God. Is there God? That includes the existence of the physical world. Is there a physical world out there? And how does my mind relate to my body? So what does he conclude there? First of all, why God? Why is he worried about God? Well, God to him is a guarantor of truth. Because remember that the Christian God is what? Omnipotent, loving, and perfect, ultimate goodness. So would this God ever lie to you? Descartes says no, this God cannot lie. So if there is God, then you can be sure the world is real. That's how he kind of gets out of the solipsism. He says, okay, I find out I have a mind. If I can also find out there is God, then everything else is real. Why? Because the God is not going to lie to me and give me a fake world. The God is good. So then he moves on to proof of the existence of God, but approaches it in somewhat of a different way than Aquinas. Because remember what was the proof of God for Aquinas? How did he prove the existence of God? Or tried to. He said the world has this feature, and therefore I can start with the world and go back and prove that there must have been somebody who did that. So now I experience it in the world. So for example, everything has a cause, so the world itself should have a cause, and that is God. But for Descartes, he is doubting the world. The world may not even exist, so he can't do that. He's starting from God. He's not starting from the world, he's starting from God. And he says, I have an idea of God. It's in my head already. I know that because it's right there. This is a quote. He says, my perception of the infinite that is God is in some way prior to my perception of the finite that is myself. He thinks God is one of those ideas which is like the basic principle, which is right there in my nature before I even born. It will necessarily follow that I am not alone in the world, but that some other thing which is the cause of this idea also exists. Why? Because he says that idea could not have come from nothing. The idea of God, such a perfect being, where would it come into my head? It's impossible for it to be generated by my mind, because my mind is not perfect, but God is. So he says that it's like a cold stove producing heated water. You can't get heated water from a cold stove, so from a simple, finite human mind, you cannot get an idea of God, who is in infinite perfection. This is the argument step by step, right? So he says something cannot be derived from nothing. That is a simple principle we all can agree with. All effects are caused by something. Great. Then he says there must be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. Now seems a little strange to us. This is actually a scholastic principle. There must be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. So if something is the cause of another thing, let's say this is the cause of this, there must be more reality in this than in this. How can there be more reality in something than in another thing? Well, it seems a little bit weird to us to even think in this way. But basically, again, you can think of like the stove and boiling water. The stove must be hotter than the boiling water, otherwise the water is not going to boil. Okay. I have an idea of God. I know it because it's in my head. It's an infinite and perfect being. The idea of God in my mind is an effect that was caused by something. So if this is the idea of God, right, this is the idea, something must have caused it. That must be God. Because I couldn't generate it myself, it is such a perfect being. I am finite and imperfect, thus I could not be the cause of the idea. Only infinite and perfect being could cause this idea, therefore God exists. That's his argument. Now, do you guys accept it? Do you agree with that? What do you think? Did it prove it to you? So what's the problem here? There are many problems, right? One of them is like the cause must be greater than the effect. I mean, today when we think about it, it seems completely weird. And this is scholastic principle, and many people noticed it and was like, didn't you want to destroy all these old kind of ways of thinking? And here he is bringing out this scholastic principle, which he learned in Flash college. Okay, but even other than that, so he basically, the way he explains it, you can think about it this way. Could a child draw a sophisticated schema for the difficult machine, like a computer, right? Could a child produce it himself? No, because the child doesn't have this kind of knowledge. Okay, but here's another question we may ask here. Do we have a detailed knowledge of God? Like when he talks about the idea of God, obviously I don't know what was his idea of God. But anybody, even a person who is deeply religious, would that person have such a great understanding of what God is as, you know, the schema of the computer? Probably not. Like his idea would probably be like, well, there is God, which is a perfect, most best thing. But it is still a little bit vague. So from that point of view, you can say a child can produce a picture of, I don't know, some square, which he will call God, or sophisticated computer, without going into details. Can a child do that? Sure. It's just you can't explain how computer functions. But isn't it the same thing with God? Like, we can say there is God, but can we explain how God functions? So much. I don't think anybody can do that. So that's kind of weakness of his argument. Another problem which has been noticed is the famous Cartesian circle. So he says that he doubts everything, right? Because he could be deceived. And then he says that, well, some things I distinctly and clearly perceive, and I can actually trust them. And based on that, he proves the existence of God. But the argument here is this. Wait a minute. You said that you could be deceived, and only after you found God, you are sure that since God is perfectly good, he couldn't fool you. But then how come you got to God using this argument that you already trust certain things? So this is the quote from one of the objections. I have one further worry, namely, how the author avoids the reasoning in a circle when he says that we are sure that we are clearly and distinctly perceiving what we clearly and distinctly perceive is true only because God exists. But we can be sure that God exists only because we clearly and distinctly perceive this. Hence, before we can be sure that God exists, we ought to be able to be sure that whatever we perceive clearly and distinctly is true. Right? Because it's a circle. How do you know what you clearly and distinctly perceive is true? Because God wouldn't lie to me. But how do you know God exists? Because I clearly and distinctly perceive it. See the circle? So that's one of the other criticisms here. Well, Descartes' answer is this. Yeah, I can still without God be sure about certain things which I clearly and distinctly perceive. I just cannot build the longer chains of arguments And I need God for that. Whether it's a good answer, it's hard to say. But then another problem emerges, and the question becomes this. Okay, but if God never lies to us, and everything we perceive is true, how come we can be wrong sometimes? Because we are sometimes wrong. So what? That part doesn't come from God, but there are some other parts which do come from God, and how do you know which comes from God and which one is not? So his answer to this is this. He says, the will is wider than the intellect. So sometimes we allow our will to lead us the wrong way, right? Because our will is completely free. So we can actually choose the wrong things. We are not controlling ourselves correctly to get to the truth. But if we were controlling ourselves well enough, we would find it. Here's the quote. He says, so what then is the source of my mistakes? It must be simply that the scope of the will is wider than that of the intellect. But instead of restricting it within the same limits, I extend it to use to matters which I don't understand. Since the will is indifferent in such cases, it easily turns aside from what is true and good, and this is the source of all error and sin. So God doesn't lie to us, He always gives us the truth, but in order to go to the truth, like let's say this is the road to the truth, we have to go straight. But our will allows us to go in any other direction, and sometimes we do, so we kind of deviate from this. Then he also brings up the good old ontological argument, the one we already heard. He thinks that's a good argument. St. Anselm presents it, remember, and that goes like this, just in case you forgot. So basically, God is the most perfect thing. If you understand the definition of God, you understand that He has to exist, because if He didn't exist, He wouldn't be perfect. So he thinks that's another way to prove the existence of God. But then, okay, so from this, how does he know other stuff exists, right? He discovered that He exists and God exists. How does he know the world exists? Well, he says perfect God wouldn't lie to us. He says God has to tell us the truth. Existence of the physical world, he says, what causes the ideas of physical objects in my mind? It has to be physical objects. Because God produced the ideas of physical world within me, and God is perfect and good, and God would not lie. Another thing is substances. He brings it up again. Remember what substance was for Aristotle? The substance was form and matter. Right? So Descartes also talks about substances, but he thinks about them somewhat differently. First of all, his definition is this: a thing which exists in such a way as to depend on no other thing for its existence. Now, if you are consistent, and we will see how Spinoza will be consistent about that, what is the only thing which does not depend on other thing for its existence? God. Exactly. So God would be the only substance then. But Descartes actually thinks there are several substances. For whatever reason, despite his own definition, he says that there are mental and physical substances. Mental substances would be our minds and God. God is also mental substance. But physical substances would be all the matter, like the tables, the water, the board. All of this stuff is physical, and my body too. So that's the same separation at the beginning, because remember, he thinks he cannot doubt his mind, but he can doubt his body, so they must be different substances. That also, of course, helps to explain life after death, because then you can say, okay, well, when I die, my body dies, but my mind doesn't die, right? So that kind of helps us in this sense, but it actually creates a different problem, and it was noticed immediately. So if you have these different substances, the question then arises: how does your mind communicate with your body? Your mind is a different type of a substance. It's a mental substance. Your body is a physical substance. how does it communicate? How do I make my arm move like this?
The neurons? Or some
Yeah, but they are physical. If you go from the scientific point of view, yes. But remember, that also leads you to no freedom of the will, because the neurons are controlled by what? By all the laws of physics. So when we are thinking, according to scientific point of view, all it is some electromagnetic stuff happening in our brain, right? And so that really tells us what we should do. Like, we perceive some signal from the outside world, we see a danger running towards us, and then our neurons send the signal that we should run away. But this is again this materialistic, mechanical explanation. Descartes doesn't want that, so he says our mind is a completely different types of a substance. Well, great, but then how does it communicate with our body? He thought he found a solution because he thought that they discovered part of the brain which they thought they didn't know what it's for. So they thought that's the part which actually provides this communication. It allows for your mind to control your body. Well, it's always dangerous when you don't know what something is and you try to make things up about it, because of course later on scientists discovered that that is not what this part is for at all. And it's still the problem consists, because that's mind-body dualism. That's one of those questions in philosophy. It's also called Cartesian dualism, because Descartes, right? Cartesian dualism. If you separate mind and body into two different substances, you have to explain how they communicate, and that is a problem, because if they are so different, how does one control the other? So there are some interesting attempts to resolve it. So that's the wrong slide. Interactionism is one of them. Interactionism, that's after Descartes. That's already after Descartes. And some other philosophers came up with it. And basically, the explanation is like this, that when we think that we are moving, things actually are arranged in such a way that they are moving in the same time. So maybe God, like we think that we are doing something and God is moving our body or whatever at the same time. So we actually think that we are doing that. But it's kind of happening at the same time, so we don't perceive the difference. So that's kind of like one explanation. But it does seem weird. However, it escapes the problem, right? Then, like when you think you are grabbing the bottle, you really are not grabbing the bottle, but God makes it so that you, at the same time as you think about it, your body does this movement and grabs the bottle. No, in this case, it's more about scientific approach, right? Okay. It is in a sense scientific, but you're just trying to explain what is your mind and how does it control your body. But the problem is, if you try to escape this physicalism, which actually is still a problem for us today. It's like next slide talks about modern approach. So modern approach, there is reductionism. Reductionism is when you reduce everything to physical, right? And some philosophers do go down this road. They think everything's physical. Your mind is physical. It's just you have this physical brain there, and there are some electrical impulses or whatever, neurons and stuff. But the problem with this, then it becomes, indeed, we are like robots. What's the difference between us and robots? Everything then has to be already determined by the laws of physics which are happening in your brain. It's just all these neurons and so on interact depending on laws of physics. But then there's an interesting example about how to kind of explain the difference between what we perceive and what would be happening in this case. And it's so-called Chinese room experiment. So here's how it works. Let's think about it. So let's say you have a room. And there's a person in this room who does not speak Chinese language at all. And there is the book which gives him instructions. 2 openings. People give him pieces of paper with some Chinese written on them. He doesn't speak Chinese, but he looks at this, looks at his instruction, and hands out from this side a different paper which also has some other Chinese written on it. So, to people who speak Chinese, that would make sense, right? Let's say this here says, how do I get to the cinema? And this one says, you walk 100 feet, and then you turn right, and then you turn left. And you go and you really get to the cinema. But this guy, he does not speak any Chinese. He has no idea what the hell he's doing. All he does is reads the instruction and hands over the papers. So here's the thing. This is what computers do. But there is a difference what we do as human beings. Can you understand? We actually do speak language. We're not doing this. Right? So how do you account for that? Because the mechanical conception of the world only accounts for this Chinese room idea. Like, if we are like robots, that's what we do. However, it doesn't seem like that's what's really happening, does it? We actually have a much more complex relation to reality than robots. And you can teach robot AI, whatever, and robot can pretend very well that it is a human being, but it's not going to be a human being. For one thing, it's not going to have this first-person view of reality which we have. Right? So, another example. Let's say we could make the exact copy of you. Like the scientists create exact copy of you. Each molecule exactly the same. Would it be then okay to kill you? That's you already there, right? Same thing. Is it? No, it seems like something is not there, which is actually me. And it may be exact copy, but I am still here. And that guy who is like exactly like me, still not me. Right? So what is it? That's a big mystery, and that is actually one of those questions which still remain. Okay, so Descartes started the conversation. There will be very interesting developments after Descartes. We'll talk about them in the future lectures. So chapter 16 on Spinoza, that will be the reading for Thursday. I'm not going to give you to read actual Spinoza because he is a little weird. The way he writes doesn't really, it's not easy to read. But we'll talk about him because his ideas build on Descartes and they're very interesting too.